It was supposed to be a night of honor, a night when the city gathered beneath glittering chandeliers to pay tribute to its veterans. But for Joseph Barrett, it began with humiliation. He stood at the grand entrance of the Carlton Museum, worn jacket zipped tight against the evening chill, polished shoes that had seen better years, and an envelope trembling slightly in his weathered hands. Inside that envelope, a personal invitation to the Night of Valor Gala. But the young man guarding the door, Ethan, according to the sharp silver name tag, didn't even glance at the letter. He glanced at Joe, the jacket, the shoes, the lined face. And just like that, he'd already made up his mind. "Sir, this is a black tie event. Guests only." Ethan's voice was polite, but only on the surface. Underneath was a current of condescension. "Your name's not on the main list." Joe held up the envelope. "It's right here. Dr. Harrow invited me personally for the exhibit." His voice was calm, steady, but it carried a quiet urgency. Ethan didn't budge. "That's a supplemental invite, not the official guest list. And even if it was, we have a dress code. No bomber jackets, no exceptions." Behind him, the golden light of the lobby spilled out, framing figures in tuxedos and gowns. Waiters carried silver trays of champagne, a world that seemed as far from Joe's as the battlefields he once walked. A few nearby guests had begun to notice the exchange. Some glanced over with mild curiosity, others with thinly veiled disdain. One woman whispered to her husband, eyes flicking disapprovingly to Joe's scuffed shoes. Joe's shoulders straightened. He didn't argue. He'd fought battles far harder than this. He'd learned long ago that people judged what they could see, not what they couldn't. And what they couldn't see was the history etched into every fold of that jacket. "I served in the 2nd Infantry," he said quietly. "The exhibit tonight, the Echo Ridge display, I contributed some pieces. Dr. Harrow requested I attend." Ethan barely glanced at him. "I'm sorry. The policy's clear. You'll have to step aside. You're holding up the line." A fresh wave of guests swept past, their laughter light, their perfume heavy. Joe felt himself becoming invisible, a ghost at a gala meant to honor men like him. But he stayed. Not for himself. For the men who couldn't be here. The ones who hadn't made it home. And he wasn't leaving. Not yet. Joseph Barrett wasn't the kind of man who corrected people when they made assumptions. He'd spent too many years learning that patience outlasted pride. At 76, his days were quiet. He lived alone in a modest apartment a few miles from the museum. No plaques on the walls. No uniforms in display cases. Just a shelf with faded photographs, young faces in military gear, arms slung over each other's shoulders, frozen in time. He volunteered at the VA hospital twice a week, not to talk about his own past, but to listen, to sit with men and women who carried the same invisible weight. Sometimes, when a younger veteran broke down in frustration or silence, Joe would offer a few words. Not advice, just understanding. To most, he was the quiet old man who could fix radios, change a tire, or rebuild a fence without charging a dime. Kids in the neighborhood called him Mr. Joe. Adults called him Sir, mostly out of habit once they learned he was Army. What they didn't know, what almost nobody knew, was that in the winter of 1968, deep in the trenches at Echo Ridge, Sergeant First Class Joseph Barrett had led a battered platoon through a siege that lasted 6 days. No food, no reinforcements, no warmth except what they could scavenge and share. And when the enemy broke through the perimeter, Joe had carried 3 wounded men, including a young lieutenant named Marcus Steele, through enemy fire to safety. That jacket Ethan mocked, it wasn't just old leather. It was the same bomber jacket Joe had worn that winter. The same one that bore the frostbite stains, the burn marks from mortar blasts, the sewn-up tears from barbed wire and shrapnel. He didn't wear it out of stubbornness. He wore it because it reminded him every day who he was and who he'd saved. But none of that mattered to Ethan, or the guests whispering behind their champagne glasses. Joe knew exactly how they saw him. And that was fine. because soon, the truth would speak for itself. Ethan's patience was running thin now. The line of guests was backing up, and a few prominent donors were starting to frown in his direction. "I'll ask you one last time, sir," he said, lowering his voice but sharpening his tone. "Step aside. You're creating a scene." Joe didn't move. The envelope in his hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the cold edge of humiliation, the same cold he had felt in the trenches all those years ago. "I've got an invitation," Joe repeated quietly. "Dr. Harrow said he needed me here." But Ethan wasn't listening. He was already waving over another staff member, a tall man in a sharp suit who eyed Joe the way one might inspect a malfunctioning piece of equipment. "I'm sorry," the suited man said briskly. "This is a private event. Only confirmed guests. We have a dress code. The general public entrance is around the side, sir." The words hit harder than any physical blow. The general public. As if he were some random tourist who had wandered into the wrong place. Joe opened his mouth to speak, but something stopped him. A ripple moved through the waiting crowd, polished shoes shifting uncomfortably, sequined gowns swishing as guests whispered behind manicured hands. "Poor man probably doesn't understand," someone muttered. "Maybe he's homeless." The words stung not because they were cruel, but because they were so casually said. Joe's eyes flicked to the marble floor. He shouldered the weight of those looks, the way he had once shouldered the weight of fallen comrades. And yet, a stubborn voice inside refused to back down. "I didn't come here for them. I came because the ones who can't be here would have wanted me to." Still, the power imbalance was undeniable. Ethan stood tall, flanked by staff, and supported by the unspoken authority of wealth and image. Joe stood alone, his jacket a silent testament to a history nobody cared to know. At least, not yet. The warmth from the lobby spilled across the marble floor, stopping just short of where Joe stood. It might as well have been 1,000 miles away. The suited man leaned in, lowering his voice like he was doing Joe a favor. "If you leave now, sir, there won't be any trouble. Security won't have to get involved." Security. That single word hit harder than the others. Joe had faced down artillery fire, pulled brothers in arms from burning wreckage, delivered last letters to grieving families. And now? He was being told he might need to be removed from a gala that was supposed to honor men like him. He looked down at the invitation in his hand. The ink was slightly smudged from the sweat in his palm. Dr. Harrow had asked him to come. Months ago, the young curator had interviewed him, taking notes as Joe reluctantly shared memories he hadn't spoken aloud in decades. The Echo Ridge exhibit wasn't just a display, it was their story. And yet, here he was, dismissed like he didn't exist. The laughter and clinking glasses behind the velvet rope felt surreal. Guests flowed into the gala, nodding to the museum director and exchanging compliments on the tasteful decor. Not a single one paused to question why an elderly man with a worn jacket and a formal invitation was being held at the door. Joe's chest tightened. Part of him, the part worn down by years of being overlooked, wanted to turn around, to walk back into the night, back to his quiet apartment, back to the solitude he knew too well. But another part, deeper and older, held firm. Not tonight. Not when those young men's faces stared out from the exhibit walls. Not when the sacrifice of Echo Ridge was being polished into history while the survivors were pushed aside. Joe squared his shoulders and stepped away from the check-in table, not toward the door, but to a quiet spot near the velvet rope, a place where he could see into the exhibit, a place where he could wait. If Dr. Harrow didn't come, fine, he would leave quietly. But he wasn't going to disappear without giving it that chance. Not tonight. Minutes passed. 5, then 10. The gala roared to life beyond the velvet rope. Spotlights bathed the grand staircase in gold. Musicians struck up a soft, elegant tune. Laughter floated through the air like perfume. But Joseph Barrett stood in the shadows, unseen, until someone noticed. A young woman, barely in her 20s, wove her way through the crowd, a clipboard clutched to her chest. Her black dress was plain compared to the glittering gowns around her. A name tag pinned crookedly to her bodice read Maya, museum intern. She paused, biting her lip nervously before approaching. "Sir? Excuse me, are you waiting for someone?" Joe turned. For a moment, he thought she might be another staff member here to tell him to leave. "I have an invitation," he said quietly, holding out the envelope once more. "But I'm not exactly properly dressed, it seems." Maya didn't glance at his jacket. She looked at his face. The lines around his eyes. The quiet endurance there. "I remember Dr. Harrow saying he was expecting someone special tonight. Someone who helped with the Echo Ridge exhibit." She glanced at the check-in table. "Was that you?" Before Joe could answer, a sharp voice sliced through the moment. "Maya!" Ethan strode over, face tight with irritation. "I already told this gentleman he's not cleared for entry. Please return to your post." "But Ethan, Dr. Harrow said—" "I said, return to your post." His eyes flashed, not at Maya, but at Joe. "Sir, we've been patient. You need to leave now, or security will escort you out." Maya flushed with embarrassment and frustration. She looked helplessly at Joe. "I'm sorry. I was just trying to—" Joe smiled gently, the kind of smile that said he'd seen much worse. "It's all right, miss. Thank you for trying." Maya hesitated, then stepped back reluctantly. She cast a final, uncertain glance before disappearing into the crowd. Joe returned to his quiet post by the rope. One person cared enough to ask. One person noticed. It wasn't much. But sometimes, in a world full of closed doors, even a small act of kindness could hold a man upright. What none of them knew? The doors were about to be blown wide open. Just as Joe adjusted the collar of his bomber jacket, more out of habit than hope, the grand entrance doors swung open with a heavy thud. The air shifted. Polished shoes clicked sharply against the marble floor. Two uniformed aides entered first, parting the crowd like a knife through silk. Between them strode a tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp army dress uniform. 4 silver stars glimmered under the chandelier light. His chest bore rows of medals, but it was his presence that turned heads and hushed conversations. General Marcus Steele, the museum's guest of honor. The coordinator, Ethan, straightened instantly. His irritation melted into a sycophantic grin. The museum director hurried forward, already offering a hand and rehearsed words of welcome. But the general didn't even glance at them. His sharp eyes swept across the lobby, ignoring tuxedos, gowns, and even the waiting photographers. He scanned past the polished check-in desk, past the clusters of VIP guests, until his gaze locked on the quiet figure standing alone by the velvet rope. Joe Barrett. In that instant, the years between them collapsed. The general's jaw tightened. His measured stride faltered for just a second. Then, without acknowledging a single person trying to greet him, he changed direction. The aides hesitated. This wasn't in the plan. But they quickly followed as General Steele cut through the crowd. Every step was deliberate, purposeful. His polished boots echoed loudly in the stunned silence now spreading through the lobby. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Champagne glasses froze mid-air. Ethan watched, a knot of unease twisting in his stomach. Maya, the intern, spotted the general's trajectory and gasped softly, her clipboard lowering to her side. Joe stood straighter, though confusion creased his brow. He hadn't expected to see Marcus Steele here. Not tonight. Not after all these years. But here he was. And the balance of power in the room? It was about to flip. General Steele came to a stop directly in front of Joe. He didn't offer a handshake. Didn't speak right away. Instead, with military precision, he brought his right hand to his brow and delivered a sharp, flawless salute. The sound of conversations dying out was almost louder than the music had been. The entire lobby froze. The suited donors, the museum staff, the photographer holding his camera midair. Even Ethan stood stiff, confusion washing over his face. The general held the salute for a long, deliberate moment before speaking, his voice low but clear enough to carry across the room. "Sergeant First Class Joseph Barrett," he said. "It's an honor to see you again, sir." "Sir." Not Joseph. Not Mr. Barrett. "Sir." Joe's eyes widened. Decades of muscle memory kicked in, and despite the stiffness in his shoulders, he returned the salute. His hand trembled slightly, but the gesture was steady. "General Steele," Joe replied quietly. "Didn't expect to see you here, Marcus." The general dropped his salute but didn't break eye contact. His face softened into something that few in the room had ever seen before: deep respect, tinged with something even heavier: gratitude. "I came because of you," the general said simply. "I wasn't sure you'd attend." By now, the crowd wasn't just watching, they were staring, whispering. The man they'd dismissed as a nuisance, someone to be shuffled aside, was standing at attention opposite a four-star general who addressed him like a mentor. Ethan's confident smile had vanished. His expression now flickered between confusion and growing dread. Maya, standing at the edge of the gathering, clasped her hands over her mouth. The tide had shifted. And it was only the beginning. The room held its breath. General Steele took a step back and turned not just to Ethan, but to the entire glittering crowd that had gathered behind him. His voice rose, strong and unwavering, cutting through the silence. "Most of you know me as the guest of honor tonight," he began. "Decorated for service, leader of troops, survivor of battles." He paused, letting the weight of those titles settle. "But what you don't know," he continued, his voice tightening, "is that every ribbon and medal I wear, every breath I take, is because of this man." He pointed to Joe. The crowd collectively leaned in, curiosity sharpening into something deeper. 54 years ago, Steele said, "I was a young lieutenant at Echo Ridge, inexperienced, cocky. I led a patrol straight into an ambush, mortars, machine gun fire. We were outnumbered and pinned. I froze." His words echoed across the marble lobby. Even the musicians had stopped playing. The man who didn't freeze? He gestured again toward Joe. "Sergeant First Class Barrett." He took command, pulled me and two others from the line of fire, carried through enemy territory back to safety, all while wounded himself. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Ethan's face drained of color. Maya's eyes were wide, filling with tears. "This man," Steele said, his voice shaking slightly, "refused evacuation, refused to leave until every last soldier under his watch was accounted for. Men are alive today, fathers, grandfathers, because of what Joe did at Echo Ridge." He paused again. The lobby was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. "And the jacket you dismissed tonight?" Steele turned his gaze directly on Ethan now, eyes cold. "That jacket isn't just clothing. It's the same one he wore through that battle. The same one that shielded him through frostbite, shrapnel, and mortar blasts. Every tear and burn on it tells a story that none of your designer suits could ever match." Gasps swept through the crowd. A few guests lowered their eyes in shame. Others instinctively stepped back from Ethan, as though his proximity was suddenly uncomfortable. Ethan opened his mouth as if to explain himself, but no words came. General Steele's gaze swept the room. This museum claims to honor heroes. Yet tonight, its staff judged one by the cost of his jacket, rather than the content of his character. He pointed to the exhibit hall doors. "The display you're about to admire, the maps and photos in the Echo Ridge exhibit, they exist because Joe shared his memories, his truth. Without him, that piece of history would have been lost forever." The murmurs had died into a heavy, almost reverent silence. Even the museum director looked pale and stricken. Steele turned back to Joe, his tone softening. "You didn't come here for praise, Sergeant. I know that. You came to honor the men who didn't make it home." Joe swallowed hard, emotions rising in his throat. "That's right, sir." Steele nodded. Well, tonight, it's time we honor you." And with that, the power in the room fully shifted. No more whispers, no more sidelong glances. The crowd now looked at Joe not as an old man in a worn jacket, but as the living embodiment of sacrifice, courage, and honor. General Steele let the silence linger for a moment longer. Not a single person dared speak. Then he turned fully to Ethan, his expression colder than steel. "You refused entry to Sergeant First Class Joseph Barrett. You humiliated a man who represents everything this night was supposed to stand for." Ethan's face had gone completely pale. "General, I didn't know who he was. He wasn't on the primary list. His attire—" "Attire?" Steele's voice cut like a blade. "You enforced dress code over dignity, image over substance, and worse, you dismissed him not because of policy, but because you thought he didn't belong. You thought you could tell a man's worth by his clothes." A ripple of discomfort spread through the crowd. Some guests exchanged uneasy glances. Others shifted guiltily, as if they too had silently judged Joe when he first arrived. The general's voice rose, commanding the entire hall. "This is not just about Sergeant Barrett. This is about what we value, about whether we recognize true honor when it's standing right in front of us." He turned to the museum director, whose face was now a mask of regret. "And as the guest of honor tonight, I cannot continue to endorse an event that began with such a disgrace." The crowd stiffened. A few gasps broke the hush. "I hereby withdraw from this gala," Steele declared. "Effective immediately. The military delegation will also withdraw. We will not stand by while heroes are disrespected under this roof." Maya clapped a hand over her mouth. Ethan's knees seemed to buckle slightly. The general's aides stepped forward, relaying orders quietly into radios. The honor guard by the doors began packing up their flags. Several uniformed officers in the audience stood at attention, silently signaling their agreement. Steele turned back to Joe. "Sergeant Barrett, you don't need their permission to be honored. You are the standard they should have measured themselves by." The entire mood of the room shifted. What had begun as a night of shallow praise and surface-level ceremony had transformed into something deeper. A reckoning. And no one would forget it. Joe stood quietly, eyes lowered, not out of shame, but out of habit. A lifetime spent avoiding the spotlight didn't fade overnight. But tonight, there was nowhere left to hide. As the general finished speaking, a ripple of movement spread through the crowd. One by one, veterans in the audience, some in uniform, others in plain suits, began stepping forward. Old soldiers, young service members, even a few who leaned on canes or prosthetics. Without a word, they formed a loose line behind Joe. A silent show of unity, of respect. Even some of the gala guests, who had stood by silently earlier, now approached, not out of pity, but out of a dawning understanding. Maya stood beside Joe, her eyes shining. "I'm so sorry for how they treated you," she whispered. "It won't happen again." Joe nodded gently. "It's all right, miss. You saw me. That's what counts." The museum director stepped forward next, his voice heavy with remorse. "Mr. Barrett, Sergeant Barrett, I can't undo what happened tonight, but the museum owes you a public apology and a permanent place in the exhibit you helped create." Joe shook his head slightly. "I didn't come here for recognition. I came to honor the men who can't speak for themselves." General Steele smiled. "And tonight, you did." The media was already picking up the story. Phones had captured everything: the humiliation, the salute, the general's speech. By morning, headlines would tell the tale. Veteran denied entry at gala receives salute from 4-star general. Museum faces backlash. But Joe didn't care about headlines. In the days that followed, the museum held a special ceremony, not for donors or dignitaries, but for veterans and their families. Joe was given a lifetime invitation and honored in the very hall where he had once been turned away. The Echo Ridge exhibit was updated. Right at the entrance stood a plaque in honor of Sergeant First Class Joseph Barrett and all who served quietly, bravely, and without expectation of praise. Joe went back to his quiet life, fixing radios, volunteering at the VA. But people in his neighborhood now paused to shake his hand. Kids listened a little longer when he spoke. Even strangers seemed to look twice, this time with respect. And every so often, General Steele would visit. They'd sit together in Joe's small living room, not as a general and a sergeant, but as old friends bound by memories few others could understand. "I didn't shut down that gala just for you," Steele said once. "I did it to remind people what honor really looks like." Joe nodded, eyes thoughtful. "Sometimes people forget." "Then we remind them," Steele replied. "Not with anger, just with truth." And in that simple truth, Joe found the one thing he'd never sought, but had finally received. Recognition, not for how he looked, but for who he was. If you believe respect is earned by sacrifice, not by appearances, comment honor below. Like, subscribe, and share this story to remind the world what real heroism looks like.